Hi friends, how are you doing? So welcome to the revision sessions. While going through the syllabus, I have taken you through each and every line of the book. I don't think I've skipped any single line, right? So we have covered everything in detail. So in the revision sessions, I'm not going to repeat what we have already done, right? I'm going to cover what we have not done so far. So I'm going to take you through the outlines of basically we have 5 days to cover 10 chapters, so we'll cover 2 chapters in a day. So today we'll cover F1 and F2. I'll go through the outlines, and then I want to take you through some simulations, because that is something we have not attempted so far together. You may have tried at home, but together we have not tried. And if you have not tried at home, that's also fine. Today you'll get to know how a simulation looks like, what kind of approach you have to follow to tackle those questions. Okay, so let's get started. Let me share the screen. Okay, so financial F1. So yeah, so here we have, in resources, we have the outline. These outlines basically give you a summary of what we have covered in the entire chapter, module by module. So very nice sort of summary over here. Let's go through this together. So in module 1, we covered standards and conceptual framework, in which we spoke about financial accounting standards. So in the US, SEC has the legal authority to establish GAAP. Remember, who has the legal authority? SEC. In most instances, SEC has allowed the accounting profession to establish GAAP and to self-regulate. So in most instances, SEC has allowed the accounting profession to self-regulate. FASB is the current standard setting body in the US. FASB Accounting Standard Codification, FASB ASC, is the single source of authoritative non-governmental US GAAP. Remember, in governmental we said we will not follow FASB, we will follow GASB, correct? And that also not in federal government. Federal government has its own. So FASB is the single source of authoritative non-governmental US GAAP. Then then Financial Accounting Foundation, FAF, created the Private Company Council, PCC, to improve standard setting for privately held companies in the US. So for privately held companies, there are some relaxations, here and there. The goal of PCC is to establish alternatives to US GAAP where appropriate, to make private company financial statements more relevant, less complex, and cost beneficial. So accounting alternatives for private companies are incorporated into the relevant sections of the FASB ASC. And finally, IASB establishes IFRS, right? These were some of the key highlights. Then we spoke about conceptual framework for financial reporting. Terminology is the key over here. So know the fundamental qualitative characteristics. Which were the fundamental qualitative characteristics? Relevance and faithful representation, right? And in relevance, then we had 3. In faithful representation, we had 3. So total 6. And then enhancing qualitative have 4: comparability, verifiability, timeliness, understandability. You can expect questions from this area. So this is something that you must know by heart. What are the fundamental qualitative characteristics? Within that, which ones are the, which ones come under relevance, which ones come under faithful representation, and so on. So that was module 1 pretty much, at a high level. Module 2 we spoke about income statement and balance sheet. Uses of income statement and terminology. Remember gross and net. So purpose of income statement is to provide information about uses of funds in the income process, right? So uses of funds in the income process, that is expenses, and the uses of funds that will never be used to earn income, like losses. So in US GAAP we show the expenses and losses separately. Similarly we show the revenues and gains separately, correct? The sources of funds created by the expenses, revenues, and the sources of funds not associated with the earning process, gains. Know the difference between expired and unexpired cost. Remember, prepaid insurance will ultimately, the unexpired cost will ultimately become an expired cost someday. So prepaid insurance will become insurance expense, right? Fixed assets will go to the income statement through the route of depreciation, right? So unexpired cost, inventory, will become cost of goods sold. So unexpired cost will become expired cost as as time passes and when those conditions are met. Difference between gross concept and net concept. Then income from continuing operations we had. Again, what are the important things? You must know the difference between multiple step income statement and single step income statement. Now remember, whether you are following multiple step income statement or single step, there are certain items that have to be shown separately. They cannot be clubbed with any other line, right? The multiple step income statement reports revenues and expenses separately from non-operating revenues and expenses. So in the multiple step, operating section is separate, non-operating is separate. In the single step presentation, total expenses including income tax expense are subtracted from total revenues. So we club all the revenues at one place, we club all the expenses at one place, revenue minus expense, and thus income statement has a single step. In balance sheet, under US GAAP, entities may present a classified balance sheet that distinguishes current and non-current assets. And what is a classified balance sheet? That distinguishes current and non-current assets and liabilities, right? And when appropriate, a balance sheet based on liquidity is also permissible. So you can have it in order of permanency, you can have it in order of liquidity. So when appropriate, although it is not a sort of a blanket approval, when appropriate, liquidity is permissible. And then review the terminology and be able to recognize a classified balance sheet. So you must review the terminology, okay? And also you have to be comfortable with the order. Although generally they don't ask you to prepare a balance, full-fledged balance sheet, but in simulation questions you might see, you might also see, so you have to be comfortable with the order. Okay, then revenue recognition. Here we saw that the new revenue recognition standard, although it's not very new now, has a 5-step approach. Step 1, identify the contract with the customer. In this, contracts are agreements between parties that create enforceable rights or obligations. In order for revenue to be recognized, contract must be approved by all the parties, contain identifiable rights for each party, and payment terms, have commercial substance, involve probable likelihood that the entity will collect substantially all consideration owed. Contracts may be combined into single contract and are potentially modified when the price and or scope changes, right? So contracts can be potentially modified. Now remember, we said when the scope and the price both increase, then is it a new contract or a modification of contract? When just the scope increases, price remains same, then what happens? And when price increases, scope remains same, then what happens? So those kind of concepts we covered here. Then in step 2, identify the separate performance obligations in the contract. Performance obligation is a promise to transfer either a good or a service to the customer. The transfer may either be distinct or a series of substantially similar goods services. To To be distinct, the promise must be separately identifiable from other goods services within the contract, and the benefit must be available to the customer independently or when combined with their own resources. Right? Then it can be called as distinct. Step 3 was determine the transaction price. Transaction price is amount of consideration that an entity is entitled to receive in exchange for transferring the goods or service to a customer. If applicable, variable consideration, significant financing, non-cash considerations, and consideration payable to the customer should be factored into the transaction price. Here we spoke about whether to take probable or should we take weighted average, right? Remember, so when we have a few options versus when we have multiple options, or rather not options but alternatives. Okay. Step 4, once you have determined the transaction price, allocate the transaction price to the separate performance obligations. If a contract contains more than one performance obligation, the overall transaction price will need to be allocated to each separate obligation based on the amount of the expected standalone consideration applicable to each unique obligation. So here the important term was standalone price. You will allocate the contract price to the separate performance obligations based on the standalone price of those performance obligations. Discounts, variable considerations and transaction price changes should all be factored into the allocation process. Correct? Finally, step 5 we discussed recognize revenue when or as the entity satisfies each performance obligation. So here we spoke about at a point in time versus over a period of time. Remember, revenue is recognized when the performance obligation is satisfied through transferring the good or service to the customer who obtains control. Satisfaction can occur over time or at a point in time. Okay, so once you have all these 5 steps, you can recognize revenue. Presentation: a contract asset is booked when the entity has a right to consideration in exchange for goods service transferred to the customer prior to actual payment. Right, so a contract asset is booked. Contract liability is booked when an entity has the obligation to transfer goods service when the customer has already paid prior to performance. Right, something like income received in advance or unearned revenue. Contract liability, when the customer has already paid prior to performance. Module 4 was part 2 of revenue recognition. Here we spoke about certain specific applications. We spoke about franchise, we spoke about bill or hold, warranty, then consignment. We spoke about long-term construction contracts. We covered a lot of aspects over here in the second part. Specific applications within revenue recognition. Costs to obtain a contract are treated as assets if the entity expects to recover them. Right? The cost to obtain a contract is an asset if the entity expects to recover them. Costs are treated as expense if they are borne regardless of whether the contract is obtained. Right? So those expenses which we will anyways bear regardless of whether we obtain the contract or not, those will be expensed. In order for contract fulfillment cost to be recognized as an asset, they must relate directly to a contract, generate or enhance the resources of the entity and be expected to be recovered. So remember, here we had done an example on workstation. Right? The company got a contract, they installed a workstation where this particular employee was supposed to sit and perform certain obligations or perform certain services for that customer. So did we capitalize the workstation? Did we capitalize the cost of that employee or not? I hope you remember that example. So this particular para is referring to that. Then as a principle, an entity has control over the goods service prior to transfer. And revenue recognized will equal expected gross consideration. Right? So as a principal, in a principal agent relationship, the principal will recognize the gross consideration as revenue. Whereas as an agent, entity does not have control, and revenue is equal to just the fee or the commission, not the gross consideration, right? So if you are an agent and you are getting only let's say $10 in a $100 deal, then your revenue is only $10. You can't show $100 as revenue and $90 as expense. Okay, that will be inflating your income statement. You will only show $10 as your revenue. Then contracts in which an entity sells an asset and promises or has the option to later repurchase the asset represents repurchase agreements, right? An obligation to repurchase is a forward, a right to repurchase at an entity's option is a call, and right to repurchase at the customer's option is a put. So here we had the discussion of whether it is a financing arrangement or is it a final sale. Bill and hold arrangements allow revenue to be recognized prior to the customer receiving the product. Bill and hold. So you have billed the customer, but the item is still with you. You are holding the asset, whatever the product is. So you can allow revenue to be recognized. You can recognize revenue before the customer receives the product. In order to recognize revenue, there must be a substantive reason for holding the product. The entity cannot use or redirect the product, and it must be separately identified and ready for transfer to the purchasing customer. So if these conditions are met, okay, you cannot commingle that asset product with your other items of inventory. You cannot mix it up with your other items of inventory. It has to be kept separately, identified separately. It is ready for transfer whenever the customer asks, requests for it. Basically, and there has to be a substantive reason for holding it. Right, so if these conditions are met, you can recognize revenue even though the item is still lying with you. Consignment relationship exists when an entity provides the product to a dealer to be held until it is ultimately sold to a third party customer. So you have sent it to your consignee, it is lying with the consignee, it is your stock, it is your inventory on the balance sheet, it is your inventory, and it will not be considered as sold until it is sold to the ultimate customer, right? Revenue is recognized either upon ultimate sale to a customer or after the expiration of a defined period of time, if that is part of the terms of the contract. Warranties may be treated as separate performance obligations, distinct from the product covered in the contract, right? So you sold an item and then you sold a warranty also separately. So it is a separate performance obligation distinct from the product. Separate treatment is likely if the warranty is not required by law, if the coverage period is lengthy, and if there are no specific tasks required regarding compliance assurance, right? So one is the product has to come with a warranty because it is required by law. We are not talking about that case here. We are talking about when it is not required by law and coverage period is lengthy, there is no specific task required. In that case, if warranty is sold separately, it is a separate performance obligation, you can recognize the revenue accordingly, okay, regardless of the main product. So when a customer has a right to return a product, now this is a right to return. When a customer has a right to return a product, entity should book revenue for the amount of consideration it expects to receive and a refund liability and an asset related to the subsequent product recovery. Right, so many sort of scenarios we had covered, right? Repurchase arrangements, bill and hold, consignment, warranty, and right of return. Then we moved on to long-term construction contracts. In long-term construction contracts, we spoke about POC, the percentage of completion method, which recognizes revenue over the term of the construction project based on estimated profitability and cost estimates, right? Following a 4-step process. So in the percentage of completion, what all items did you need to determine the profitability? There there are certain steps that we followed, right? What is the contract price? What is the cost of the contract? So what is going to be the total profit on this project, right? Then we saw what is the percentage of completion, that means cost to date divided by the total cost to complete, right? So then we figured out a percentage and then we applied that percentage to the total profit to determine what should be the profit to date, and from that profit to date we deducted the profit that is already recognized in the previous years. Finally we got the profit to be recognized during this particular period, right? So it was a 4-step process. The completed contract method recognizes income on completion of the construction contract. This method does not match revenues and expenses over long. So here, if it's a 4-year contract, you will recognize revenue in the 4th year when the project is complete. So in the first 3 years, you are not recognizing any revenue. Both methods recognize estimated losses immediately. This is an important point. Whether you are following POC or completed contract, you would recognize the loss immediately, estimated loss immediately. Under IFRS, completed contract method is not permitted. POC method must be used unless final outcome of the project cannot be reliably estimated, in which case cost recovery method is required. So in US GAAP you have POC and completed contract method. In IFRS you have POC. Unless you cannot estimate, the outcome of the project cannot be estimated reliably, in which case you must follow cost recovery method. Under cost recovery method, revenue only can be recognized to the extent of cost incurred. Okay. Then we moved on to module 5, discontinued operations. In discontinued operations, let me read from here first. Introductions. Accounting for discontinued operations can consist of gain loss on current operations, gain loss on sale, and impairment loss. So discontinued operation section in the income statement, right? Income from continuing and then discontinued. The discontinued operation section can have only 3 items. What are those 3 items? Gain or loss on current operations, gain or loss on the sale of that operation, and the impairment loss. Discontinued operations are shown net of tax because it is below the tax line, right? Below the provision for tax line. So we show it net of tax. Of course, in the inner column you can show the gross, then the tax amount, but in the outer column you will show net of tax. Any of these must be reported as part of discontinued operations in the year incurred. So first and foremost, we discussed what is a discontinued operation. It has to be a component of an entity. So a component of an entity is a part of an entity, the lowest level for which operations and cash flows can be clearly distinguished from the rest of the entity, both operationally and for financial reporting purposes. So it has to be a component which is then either sold or is classified as held for sale. Remember? So accounting rules: the results of operations of a component of an entity or a group of components of an entity or a business or a non-profit activity will be reported in discontinued operations if it has been disposed of. So either during the year under consideration it has already been disposed of, or it is classified as held for sale, right? The disposal must represent a strategic shift that has or will have a major effect on entities' operations and financial results to be reported as a discontinued operation. So it must represent a strategic shift. Excuse me. Remember, we had also done another topic which was called exit or disposal activity. Exit or disposal activity and the liabilities relating to those. The severance packages that you have to pay to the employees, the relocation cost, the cost of breaking a contract, right? So if you obviously if you are discontinuing something or exiting from a particular activity and you already had a firm purchase commitment with another party, you are breaching that contract. So so all those liabilities we had spoken about in the exit disposal activities. So basically, if it is a discontinued operation, then it will come under the discontinued operation section. If it is not, then it will come in the income from continuing operations only, right? So you have to be able to distinguish whether it should come under income from continuing or discontinued, depending on whether these criteria are met, whether it's a component or not, whether it is meeting the criteria of classified as held for sale. Okay, those kind of things. Then we moved on to module 6, accounting changes and error corrections. In this we spoke about changes in accounting estimates, changes in accounting principle, changes in accounting entity. Then we also spoke about error corrections. And here primarily the focus was whether it is going to be retrospective or prospective, and if it is going to be, and where is it going to be adjusted, right? In the retained earnings, beginning retained earnings of the earliest period presented, those kind of things we were discussing here. So changes in estimates such as useful life of a plant asset are incorporated into the accounting records for the current and future periods. Current and future, not past. That means it is prospective. No adjustment of prior financial statements is required. So for change in estimate, you don't have to go back, you do it prospectively. Change in depreciation method is a change in accounting principle that is inseparable from a change in estimate and is accounted for as a change in estimate. Right? Remember, we said that there are two exceptions where we will not go to the past and we will do it prospectively. One was change in depreciation method, another was to LIFO. When you are moving from any other method of inventory valuation to LIFO, then you go prospective. Change in accounting principle. So change in principle or method of accounting, for example, from completed contract method to long-term percentage of completion method, etc. Change in principle involves switching from one acceptable method to another. So this is an important point here, from one acceptable method to another. If you are moving from a non-acceptable method to an acceptable method, that is an error correction. That is not a change in accounting principle. So if you are moving from a method which is not allowed under GAAP to a method which is allowed under GAAP, that's an error correction. Okay. What is change in accounting principle? When you are switching from one acceptable method to another acceptable method. The cumulative effect is the change in the retained earnings that results from restating the prior years from the old method to the new method at the beginning of the earliest year presented. That means where are we going to do this this adjustment? In the beginning retained earnings of the earliest period presented. And what are we going to adjust it with? The cumulative effect. The next bullet. The cumulative effect is reported as an adjustment to the beginning retained earnings of the earliest period presented, net of tax, in the statement of retained earnings. Okay. Next bullet, change in accounting principle exception. Now this is what I was just talking about. When it is impracticable to estimate the change in retained earnings that would result from restating the prior year financial statements, change in method is applied prospectively like a change in estimate. So if the change is such that you are not able to distinguish, it is an inseparable change. It is a change in estimate as well as a change in principle, and the two are going hand in hand. Because one is changing, the other is changing. That kind of a change would be treated as a change in accounting estimate and therefore would be done prospectively. In this case, no restatement of prior year's presentation occurs and there is no cumulative effect reported in the statement of retained earnings because you are going prospectively. Changing to US GAAP LIFO from any other inventory method is an example of this. Remember, because LIFO creates LIFO layers, it becomes impracticable to calculate. Not impossible, but impracticable. Then there was change in accounting entity. Change in entity requires restatement of prior year's financial statements to conform with the new accounting entity when the prior financials are presented comparatively. Right? So when the prior financials are presented comparatively, which means US GAAP does not make it mandatory to present comparative financial statements, correct? We already saw that. So who compels you to, or who mandates it? Regulation SX. Remember regulation SX. So when you are doing 10K annual filing, you have to do 2 balance sheets and 3 of each of the other statements. So 2 balance sheets, 3 income statements, 3 statements of comprehensive income, 3 statements of cash flows, 3 statements of changes in owner's equity, right? So 2 balance sheets and 3 of everything else. That was regulation SX, that is SEC requirement. That means only for SEC registrants, that means listed companies, right? So US GAAP does not mandate comparative financial reporting, comparative figures. IFRS does not include the concept of a change in entity. Error correction is also reported net of tax in the statement of retained earnings. Here we spoke about 3 scenarios. Number 1, when you are showing comparative, and when you are not showing comparative. So 2 scenarios, and then when you are showing comparative, in that there were further 2 scenarios. So as an example, if you are showing 2020 and comparative 2019 and the error occurred in 2016, what will you do? You will do the adjustment in the beginning retained earnings of 2019. Second scenario was you are showing 2020, you are not showing 2019, right? You are not showing comparative and the error occurred in 2016. What will you do? You will make the adjustment in the beginning retained earnings of 2020. Third scenario was you are showing 2020 and 2019, error occurred in 2019. Then you will just do the error correction over there. I mean, you will show, because you are showing 2019, you will make the correction over there. Correct? Then statement of comprehensive income. Comprehensive income includes all changes in owner's equity other than transactions with owners. Right? Other than transactions with owners. So dividend paid to shareholders is not part of comprehensive income because it is a transaction with owners. Or fresh issue of cap shares is not a item of comprehensive income, correct? So it includes all changes in owner's equity other than transactions with owners. Formula shows that comprehensive income must include net income plus or minus other changes in owner's equity not resulting from transactions with owners. These other changes are known as OCI, other comprehensive income items. OCI items are revenues, expenses, gains, losses that are included in comprehensive income but excluded from net income. That means basically we are saying that these items are not yet ready to be taken to the income statement, therefore we are parking them over here for the time being. Mnemonic was puffier, where you have P as pension adjustments, right? Remember Sir age, in which age items go to OCI and then they go to income statement over a period of time, right? And for that we had different formulas. For some it was 15 years, for some it was average remaining employee life or 15 years, whichever is greater. There was a corridor approach, all of that. Pension adjustments. Then there was unrealized gain losses on available for sale debt securities, right? Not the trading securities, not the held to maturity securities, only the available for sale, and that also not equity securities, the debt securities, and not the realized gain loss, the unrealized gain loss, right, on the available for sale debt securities. Then we had foreign currency translation items. So remember we had 2 steps. One, when we were moving from local currency, in fact 3 steps. First was when we were moving from any other GAAP to US GAAP, right? Then we were moving from local currency to functional currency, and then from functional currency to reporting currency, right? So one was the remeasurement method, the other was the translation method. So here we are talking about the translation gain loss will go to OCI, right? Then instrument specific credit risk. This is something that has been added later. It was not there initially as part of OCI, but through amendments. Yeah, so that reminds me that I have to cover amendments also with you. So maybe in the next class, first 15-20 minutes, I will cover, or it might take half an hour also, we'll cover amendments. Okay. Instrument specific credit risk, then there is effective portion of cash flow hedge, right? So when you do or get a question on hedge, you have to first see whether it is a fair value hedge or a cash flow hedge, unless the question specifies. If the question specifies, it will make your life easier. Otherwise, you will have to identify. And then, if it is a cash flow hedge, then the effective portion of cash flow hedge will go to OCI. In case of fair value hedge, whether it is effective or ineffective, doesn't matter, it will go to income statement, right? So in case of a fair value hedge, you don't have to worry whether it is effective or ineffective, the entire gain loss will go to income statement. In case of cash flow hedge, only the effective portion will go to OCI. The ineffective portion will still go to income statement. And then revaluation, which is a concept under IFRS, revaluation surplus, recognized when intangible assets and fixed assets are revalued under IFRS, will go to OCI, right? Not the revaluation loss, only the revaluation gain or the surplus. So puffier, pension, unrealized gain loss, foreign currency, instrument specific credit risk, effective portion of cash flow hedge, revaluation surplus. AOCI, accumulated OCI, is the cumulative sum of all the individual components of OCI. Accumulated OCI is an owner's equity item, so it is under the stockholders equity section, correct, as a separate line. It's a separate line, right, called AOCI. Financial statement reporting, both US GAAP and IFRS allow the statement of comprehensive income to be presented using one statement approach or the two statement approach. So in income statement also we had two options, single step and multiple step. Here we have one statement and two statement approach. Other reporting issues, components of OCI income may be reported either net of tax or before related tax effects, right, with one amount shown for the aggregate income tax expense or benefit related to the total OCI items. Finally, the last module was adjusting journal entries. Here you needed a lot of practice. I had asked you to do a lot of questions on adjusting journal entries. If your basics are not very strong, then I had recommended that you go through some of the basic books, in case you are studying after many years and you have lost touch, etc. I had recommended that you go through some basic books, which will make your concepts of journal entry, T accounts, ledger posting, all those concepts very clear and strong. I hope you have done that. So in adjusting journal entries, we spoke about matching revenues and related expenses. So accrual basis accounting matches the revenues with expenses. In order to properly match the revenues with expenses, it is necessary to defer or accrue revenues or expenses. Defer or accrue. So that is why in the year end we will move certain items from expense to prepaid or from income to unearned income, etc. We will do those adjustments at the year end. Depreciation entry, accrued interest, those kind of entries are passed at the year end. So if revenue has been deferred, company must calculate the amount of revenue that can be recognized through year end and make appropriate adjusting entry, right? So if you have put everything in deferred but you can recognize some part of it, then you will have to take it out of deferred and put it in revenue. For that you have to pass the entry. Similarly, if expenses have been prepaid, company must calculate the amount of expenses that have been incurred through the year end and make appropriate adjusting entry, because some portion of it may have fallen in the current year, so you can take that to expense, right? So you will take it out of prepaid and put it in expense. For that you have to pass the adjusting entry. Entity must assess whether the performance obligation has been met and revenues can be recognized prior to the cash being received, right? If so, revenues must be accrued by recording a receivable. Then next, entity must also assess whether expenses have been incurred prior to cash being paid, right? If so, expenses must be accrued by recording accrued liability or accounts payable or other payable, for example wages payable. So you have already taken the service of the laborer, you have not yet paid the laborer, it is a payable, right? You have to accrue for it. So again, that you will do through an adjusting journal entry. In some instances, an entity may record receipts to a revenue or expense account when they should have been recorded to an asset or liability account. So for example, you have expensed off an item, a capital item. You should have capitalized it, but you have inadvertently expensed it off. Now you will have to do that adjustment. An adjusting entry may be required to ensure that the financials are in accordance with the accrual basis of accounting. The opposite can also happen. Sometimes you may capitalize an item of revenue expenditure. So again, you will have to do that correction. So rules for adjusting journal entries are: adjusting journal entry must be recorded by the end of the entity's fiscal year before the preparation of the financial statements. So practically, a lot of companies have this concept called period 13, okay, which is basically 31st December. That means January is period 1, February is period 2, March is period 3, and so on, and December 1 to December 30th is period 12. So you have 12 months in the year, you have 12 periods, but your 12th period is December 1 to December 30th, and then December 31st is called the 13th period, where you put all the adjusting entries. So when you go back and track that what journal adjusting journal entries you passed, you just pull out the period 13 entries and you will get all the entries at one place. So a lot of companies follow this period 13 concept, okay, even in India. Rules for adjusting journal entries. So yeah, so second sub bullet is: adjusting journal entries never involve cash account. They never involve cash account. This is something you already know, I guess, but you need to know and remember that they will never have cash, a debit to a cash account. Here cash means cash and cash equivalent, so a debit to a cash or a bank, or a credit to a cash or a bank. It will not basically involve any cash account. All adjusting journal entries will hit one income statement account and one balance sheet account, because you're moving stuff from one to the other, right? So that was pretty much on F1. Let's quickly go through F2, and then we'll have some time for discussing a couple of simulations. F2 was simpler. It had some small simple topics. First module had notes to financial statements, where we said that there are two things: summary of significant accounting policies and then remaining notes to the financial statements, right? The summary of significant accounting policies reflects the methods and policies employed by the firm. Here you can expect some questions which will ask you to identify which of these four is an accounting policy or a significant accounting policy. So which one out of these four options is a significant accounting policy, or it could be the other way also: which one is not a significant accounting policy? Okay, those kind of questions. Remaining notes will have all other notes, and if you see, I don't know if you have seen actual financial statements of any company, notes to financial statements runs into pages. There are so many notes. If you look at some Fortune 100 companies' financial statements, you will see that notes are running into 40, 50, 60 pages, sometimes even more than 100 pages, just the notes to financial statements. So remaining notes contain all other information relevant to decision makers. These notes are used to disclose facts not presented in either the body of the financials or in the summary of significant accounting policy. That means there is no duplication. We are disclosing facts here which have not been presented elsewhere. okay, elsewhere in the financial statements, not presented in either the body of the financial statements or in the summary of significant accounting policies. Examples of remaining notes include material information regarding inventory, property, plant and equipment, other significant asset liability balances, changes in stockholders' equity, fair value estimates, contingency losses, contractual obligations, pension plan description, segment reporting, subsequent events, changes in accounting principles, or implementation of new accounting standards updates. This is running very fast. Yeah. Disclosures of risks and uncertainties under US GAAP. US GAAP requires disclosures of risks and uncertainties existing at the date of financial statements in the following areas: nature of operations, if you have any risk or uncertainty in your nature of operation, in your use of estimates, in the preparation of financial statements, certain significant estimates, current vulnerability due to certain concentrations. Remember, concentrations, very important. So you will have to disclose risks and uncertainties relating to these. IFRS requires an explicit and unreserved statement of compliance with IFRS. So US GAAP does not require this kind of a statement, but IFRS requires an explicit statement, unreserved statement that you have complied with IFRS. Okay. In the notes to the financial statements, an entity cannot describe financial statements as complying with IFRSs unless they comply with all IFRS requirements. That means, obviously, to be able to say that you have complied with IFRS, you must comply with all the IFRS, right? So even if you have not complied with a single IFRS, you cannot say that you are IFRS compliant. US GAAP does not have this kind of a requirement. Module 2 had going concern. Okay, an entity is considered to be a going concern if it is reasonably expected to remain in existence, and not just that, and settle all its obligations. Not just that it is expected to remain in existence, but it is also expected to settle all its obligations for the foreseeable future. And this foreseeable future, we had seen, it is different under US GAAP and IFRS. Under US GAAP, it was 1 year from the financial statement issuance date, and in IFRS, it was 1 year from the balance sheet date, the financial statement date, the balance sheet date, right? Now, going concern is a presumption. That means it is presumed to be a going concern unless we have, evidence to the contrary. So under US GAAP, preparation of financial statements presumes that the reporting entity will continue as a going concern. It presumes. That means we will not have to give a separate disclosure that the company is a going concern, because that is already presumed. We don't need to give that disclosure. Yes, if there is a doubt about its going concern, about its ability to continue, substantial doubt about its ability to continue, right, as a going concern, then we will give a disclosure, regardless of whether that doubt has been alleviated during the year or not alleviated during the year. Regardless, we will give a disclosure, right? So, under this presumption, financial statements are prepared under going concern basis of accounting. So, even if there was a substantial doubt about its ability to continue, we will still prepare the financials under going concern basis of accounting. Even if the doubt has not been alleviated yet, as of the financial statement issuance date, we will still go with going concern basis of accounting. When will we not go with going concern basis of accounting? When liquidation is imminent. Okay, when liquidation is imminent, then we will not follow going concern basis of accounting. We will follow the liquidation basis of accounting. Whose responsibility is it to evaluate? Management's. Management is required to evaluate whether there is substantial doubt about entity's ability to continue as a going concern within 1 year after the date the financials are issued. Within 1 year after the date the financial statements are issued. Okay, so 1 year from the financial statement issuance date. When mitigating factors, if conditions or events exist that raise substantial doubt about entity's ability to continue as a going concern, management should consider whether the entity's plans intended to mitigate those conditions, or if events will be successful in evaluating the substantial doubt. Right? So if there was a substantial doubt, during the year, and management has planned to take certain mitigating actions, then management has to evaluate first of all whether those plans, the plan to mitigate, whether those plans will be implemented, and number two, if implemented, will they be successful, right? So management has to evaluate these things. Result of evaluation: there are three going concern categories based on management's evaluation, including no substantial doubt, and substantial doubt alleviated, and substantial doubt not alleviated. So there are three scenarios. Number one, there is no substantial doubt, matter closed. No substantial doubt, no problem, no disclosure also required. Substantial doubt arose but it got alleviated, disclosure required, and substantial doubt arose and not alleviated, also disclosure required. But in all the three scenarios, we will continue to follow going concern basis of accounting, right, which is the normal basis of accounting. Difference between US GAAP IFRS was that when there is substantial doubt about entity's ability to continue as a going concern, when there is a substantial doubt about an entity. So basically what I already spoke about is that in IFRS it is 1 year from the balance sheet date, under US GAAP it is 1 year from the financial statement issuance date. Okay, then we spoke about subsequent events. Oh God. Right. So then we spoke about subsequent events. In this we spoke about couple of things: a recognized subsequent event, a non-recognized subsequent event. And then what period do we consider for evaluating subsequent events? Is it the financial statement, issuance date, or is it when it is available to be issued? Remember, is it available to be issued or is it the issuance date? And then recognized, non-recognized events. Do we pass a journal entry? Do we just give a disclosure? What do we do? So subsequent event is an event or transaction that occurs after balance sheet date but before the financials are issued or are available to be issued. Recognized subsequent event provides additional information about conditions that already existed at the balance sheet date. So that's a recognized subsequent event. Entities must recognize the effect of all the recognized subsequent events in the financial statement. That means we will have to pass a journal entry. Non-recognized subsequent events provide information about conditions that occurred after the balance sheet date, that did not exist at the balance sheet date. They occurred only after the balance sheet date. Therefore, they are not to be recognized. Entities should not include non-recognized subsequent events in the financial statements. Period: an entity that files financial statements with SEC must evaluate subsequent events through the date the financials are issued. So SEC registrants will have to consider all the way up to the issuance date. All other entities must evaluate through the date the financials are available to be issued. Okay, and what is available to be issued? When the financials are already in a form and format which complies with GAAP and all approvals have been obtained, right? So that means it is available to be issued, it is just that it has not been issued yet. Reissuance and revised financials. Revised financials are considered reissued financial statements. So reissued: when an entity reissues financial statements, the entity should not recognize events that occurred between the date the original financials were issued or available to be issued and the date the financials were reissued. Not to be recognized. Subsequent events not to be recognized between these two dates. Unless of course an adjustment is required by GAAP or other regulatory requirement, of course then you have to do it. Otherwise you have to ignore the subsequent events from the date the original financials were issued or were available to be issued and the reissuance date. Okay. Alright, then we move to this important topic, fair value measurement. Fair value is the exit price. Remember, exit price, not an entry price. So fair value is the price that would be received to sell an asset. You want to exit from this asset, you want to sell this asset. What is the price that would be received to sell an asset or paid to transfer a liability in an orderly transaction between market participants in the principal market? And if there is no principal market, then in the most advantageous market at the measurement date under current market conditions. So most advantageous market is the market with the best price for the asset or liability after considering transaction cost. After considering transaction cost. So in the fair value, we will not consider transaction cost, but in determining which is the most advantageous market for us, we will consider transaction cost. Remember, fair value measurement framework, entities can use the MIC, market approach, income approach, cost approach, MIC. Entities can use the market approach, income approach, cost approach, or a combination of these approaches. And fair value hierarchy prioritizes the inputs used in the market cost income valuation techniques. Level 1 has the highest priority, level 3 has the lowest. And remember, it's very easy to identify, and you can expect questions on this, whether out of the 4 which one is level 1, or out of the 4 answer choices which one is a level 2 or which one is a level 3. So those kind of identification questions, it's very easy to remember. Okay, they have not given it here, but I hope you have revised. Identical, remember identical asset or similar asset. So quoted price in an identical quoted price of an identical asset in an established market. So those kind of conditions were there. If all those 3 conditions were met, it was level 1, right? And level 3 is unobservable inputs. So anything in between is level 2. In an so quoted price of an identical asset in an active market, correct? Those 3 conditions were there. Fair value disclosure. Objective of fair value disclosure is to provide users of financial statements with information about assets and liabilities measured at fair value, including the valuation technique, the uncertainty in the fair value measurement, how changes in fair value affects the entity's performance and cash flows. Disclosures were there. Exceptions to fair value measurement: when it is not practical to measure fair value, when fair value cannot be reasonably determined, fair value cannot be measured with sufficient reliability. Basically, if you cannot measure or determine, then obviously you can't follow. So GAAP gives you some relaxation over here. Okay, another important topic, easy but important, segment reporting. Here we saw that in order to conform to US GAAP and IFRS, financials for public business entities must report information about companies' operating segments, products and services, geographic areas and major customers. So this is for public entities, that means listed companies, segment reporting, right? And here we saw that there was again a step-by-step process. It has to be a component, then we have to determine out of the components that the entity has, how many of them are operating segments, and then out of the operating segments, how many are reportable segments, and then finally we have to give certain disclosures regarding those reportable segments, right? So there was a 10% test, there was a 75% test. Operating segment, a reportable segment exists if it meets one of the 3 quantitative tests: 10% of combined revenue, internal and external parties, 10% of the greater of the reported profit or loss, absolute amount, 10% of the combined assets of all operation segments, right? So if you meet any one of these conditions, then it's a reportable segment. 75% test is called reporting sufficiency test. Okay, sometimes in the question they will not mention 75%, they will say reporting sufficiency test. So you have to understand they are talking about the 75% test. Okay, is a catch-all requirement that may require identification of additional segments to attain 75% level. This test requires that reportable segments total at least 75% of the revenue from external parties. Remember, So when we did the 10% test, we included internal and external revenue both. But when we did the reporting sufficiency test, we considered only the external revenue. Now, in doing the reporting sufficiency test, you may have to add a segment which was not identified as a reportable segment, due to the 10% test. It was not identified as a reportable segment. That means it did not meet the 10% criteria, but still you are adding it to make 75%. You should be familiar with the definition of operating profit. Segment revenues from sale to internal and external customers, less directly traceable cost and reasonably allocated cost. So how do you determine operating profit or loss or segment profit or loss? You take the segment revenue, you deduct the directly traceable cost, and then you deduct the reasonably allocated cost, right? That gives you the segment operating. So what I'll do is we will do one simulation from segment reporting. I need you to identify the segments, okay, when we just go to the simulation. And then there were disclosures around that reportable segments. You have to disclose the segment profit loss, segment assets, certain other related items. Under IFRS, entities must also disclose segment liabilities, but there is a condition. They have to disclose segment liabilities only if such a measure is provided to the chief operating decision maker. That means if the chief operating decision maker in his reviews the segment liabilities also, in that case we will have to show it. And certain related items. US GAAP does not require disclosure of segment liabilities. Also, you have to give certain disclosures, entity-wide disclosures, like products and services, geographic area, major customers, etc. Then we had SEC reporting requirements. In this, there is a small amendment that has come in, which I will cover in the next class. I'll cover all the amendments in the next class. It will probably take half an hour or so. Okay. Or we can do one more thing. We can do the amendments. Since we are covering F1 and F2 today, I can just take you through the amendments of F1 and F2 today. And when we cover F3, F4, the amendments of F3, F4 along with that also can be done. Let me quickly finish this. Then there is just one amendment in F1 and F2, which is from this area, SEC reporting requirement, and that also in the recognition of large accelerated company. Okay, so remember we had different due dates. For 10K we had 60 days, 75 days and 90 days, depending on whether you are a large accelerated company or any other company. Similarly 10Q we had 40 days and 45 days. So there is no change in that. Only thing is that now they have also put in a revenue criteria that if your revenue is below a certain threshold, okay, if I am not mistaken, it's $100 million. I'll just show it to you. So if your revenue is below that level, then you will not be considered as an accelerated or a large accelerated company. That's the only amendment in all of F1 and F2. Okay. Form 10K must be filed annually by US registered companies. Filing deadline is 60 days, so 75 days and 90 days. And you have to show the MD&A, management discussion and analysis, and audited financial statements in 10K. 10Q is quarterly, again by US registered companies. Filing deadline is 40 days, 45 days. And here you show interim period MD&A and certain disclosures, and you show unaudited financial statements. So you show reviewed financial statements. So the quarterly financials that you submit to the SEC are not audited financial statements, they are reviewed financial statements, that is reviewed by a CPA, okay, not audited. And what is the difference between audit and review, that we will cover in the audit subject, in the audit paper, okay, which is starting on 21st. I don't know how many of you are attending that. Audit is starting from 21st, which is basically this coming weekend. Regulation S-X SX outlines the form and content of and requirements for interim and annual. Now here the important thing is that you have to remember how many balance sheets, how many income statements, etc. How many cash flows are to be shown in quarterly and in annual. Annual I have already told you, 2 balance sheets and 3 of everything else. But in quarterly it is different for different items, right? So balance sheet is different, income statement is different, and so on. So a quick recap. Balance sheet, if I am preparing Q3, then which balance sheets do I have to show? I have to show September 30th balance sheet of 2020 Q3, right? September 30th 2020 balance sheet, and I have to show the December 31 2019 balance sheet. Basically the end of the quarter and the end of the preceding fiscal year. Remember, if I am talking about Q2, then I am showing 30th June balance sheet, 30th June 2020 and 31st December 2019. But income statement was very different. Income statement, what was I showing? If let's say if I am talking about Q3, then what am I supposed to show? I am supposed to show July to September income statement of 2020, July, August, September, because we are talking about Q3. So July, August, September income statement 2020. Then I am also going to show January to September 2020, the year to date income statement. Okay, January to September 2020 income statement. Then I am going to show the corresponding of these two, the corresponding. That means I am also going to show July, August, September 2019 and Jan to September 2019. Apart from this, I may also be required to show two more. The cumulative 12 month, that means 1st October 2019 to 30th September 2020, and the corresponding to that, which is 1st October 2018 to 30th September 2019. So 6 income statements. So these things you have to remember. You have to now start remembering certain things. Okay, if you have not started studying so far, please start now. I mean, if you want to take the exam soon. Otherwise also keep revising, otherwise it will disappear from your head. Okay, XBRL reporting. SEC's interactive data rules requires US public companies and foreign private issuers that use US GAAP as well as foreign private issuers that use IFRS to present financials and any applicable financials in an exhibit prepared using XBRL. Here you have to just know certain terminologies like what is a taxonomy, what is a tag, and of course what is the due, you have a 30-day grace period, stuff like that. This area is not very tested. It is not a heavily tested area, but some question here and there might appear. Special purpose framework, here we spoke about OGBOA, the other comprehensive basis of accounting. In this we spoke about cash basis of accounting, modified cash basis of accounting, income tax basis of accounting, right? Basically these three. And then we saw that there are also other types like regulatory basis of accounting, contractual basis of accounting, and so on. And then in this we saw how to convert a cash basis financial statement to an accrual basis and vice versa. And here the steps are pretty much opposite to what you did in the cash flow statement, right? Then of course ratios was very basic class 12th level, right? Liquidity ratios, activity ratios, profitability ratios, coverage ratios. These were the 4 major heads under which we did the ratios: liquidity, activity ratios, profitability ratios, coverage ratios. And then we had partnership, where we spoke about admission, withdrawal of a partner, liquidation of partnership, right? And then we saw that there are different methods, exact methods. So let me quickly take you through this. Contribution by partner to a partnership are recorded at fair value less the PV of the liability assumed by the partnership. So this is at the time of admission, of course, right? Contributions by a partner are recorded at fair value of whatever asset the partner has contributed, less if the partner has also given a liability, then less PV of the liability assumed by the partnership. That's the contribution. Admission of new partners may be accounted for using the exact method, bonus method, goodwill method. Remember? And here the calculations were very different. The approach was very different of how to calculate. So, and also you have to be very careful in the question because the wording, remember we saw that in the bonus example and the goodwill example, the wording was exactly the same. The facts were exactly the same. There was only one line that was differentiating the two, is that the partners decided to show goodwill or raise goodwill, and the other one said the partners decided not to show goodwill. So that differentiated between the two methods, and then accordingly your calculation was different. Profit and loss distribution will be of course in accordance with their agreement, and in the absence of an agreement it will be equally. Withdrawal of a partner, again here we had two methods, bonus method and goodwill method. So in admission we had three methods, exact, bonus and goodwill. In withdrawal we had bonus and goodwill. And then in liquidation we saw that there is a certain order. We will sell off all the assets, pay off all the outside liabilities, including partners who are who have a, let's say, loan, etc. So, and then we will pay the capital of the partners, and then if there is something remaining we will distribute it to the partners. So when partnership is liquidated, assets are sold, gains losses are allocated to the partnership, liabilities are paid, and partners are entitled to receive the balance in their capital account. Partners who wind up with debit balance owe their deficiency to the partnership and other partners. So remember, there was a right of set off, so we could set off against their capital accounts and so on. If the capital deficiency remains outstanding, the deficiency then finally must be absorbed by the remaining partners. In that example, which was a full page example, we had three different scenarios. In the last scenario there was a case of deficiency which was borne by the other partners, right? And then after bearing the deficiency of one partner, another partner's capital became deficient, and then finally it was absorbed by the third partner. Okay, so that was F1 and F2, a quick sort of recap of what we had done. See, we have come a long way, we have covered the entire syllabus, but you still have a long way to go. Okay, you have to do 4 revisions. I have told you this before, you have to do 4 thorough revisions before you sit for the exam. 4 thorough revisions, right? And every time you have to treat it like it's your first revision, as if you have not read it before. You can't skip anything. You will be tempted to skip, but you should not. Okay, now let's do a couple of simulations. I want to show you how simulations look like and how do you approach. So let's go with this. System is a bit slow. Now see, this is how, if you have not seen a simulation before, then this is how it looks like. Okay. Of course, in the real exam, the screen is a big screen, and you will be able to open the exhibits. If there are multiple exhibits. So these are called exhibits. This email from accountant, email attachment number 1, email attachment number 2, these are called exhibits. Basically, they will give you information through exhibits. You will have to open the exhibits to, look for certain information to be able to give the correct answer. So the screen is pretty big in the real exam, and you will be able to open 3-4 exhibits side by side, so that it becomes easy for you. Otherwise what happens is, you have to close one, open the other. So there is enough space to open simultaneously also, is what I'm trying to say. You can also split the screen. So there are those features, those functionalities available. Now in this, what are they asking? Let's go through the simulation. On July 1, year 1, the board of directors of All Seasons Sports Inc. voted to dispose of the ski and snowboard operating segment of the company. The company was committed to its plan to sell the segment, believed that the segment could be sold for no more than 2.5 million, and was actively looking for a buyer. So these are all indications to tell you that that this particular segment is classified as held for sale, right? The board has voted, there is a commitment to the plan, it will, there is a likelihood that it will be sold, they are actively looking for a buyer, etc. On April 1, year 2, the division was finally sold to We Love Winter Inc. for a sale price of 3.2 million. All Season Sports paid a broker's fee of 10% of the sale price when the transaction was closed. Okay, so far so good. Have you understood the thing? That basically there is a segment that they are trying to sell off. All Season Sports has a tax rate of 30%. And not just trying to sell off, it has been sold off in April 1 of year 2. Now, using the information in the exhibits to calculate the gain or loss from the discontinued operations for year 1 and year 2. So for both the years, we will have to show what will appear under discontinued operations. Enter the gain as positive whole dollars and losses as negative whole dollars. If there is no gain or loss, enter a 0. Don't leave it blank. Okay. So if there is no gain or loss, then also you will have to enter a 0. Otherwise, the computer will not take it as an answer and it will not allocate marks to you. Now this is the question. Okay. So yeah. So we will have to show in year 1 what is the impairment gain loss, what is the operating gain loss, what is the gain loss on disposal, and obviously if it has been disposed of in year 2, so gain loss on disposal in year 1 will be 0, we will have to put a 0. And again, what is the impairment gain loss in year 2, operating gain loss in year 2, gain loss on disposal in year 2, and of course the income tax benefit. So income tax benefit or expense 30%. So that amount also we will have to input it here. Okay. Now let's see what the exhibits are showing. From accountant at allseasons.com to controller at allseasons.com, subject discontinued operations. Sam, I have compiled the information you requested regarding the sale of the ski and snowboard operating segment. I pulled the income statement for year 1 and year 2 and this particular segment, so we will have an idea of what to report in the financial statements. In case you are interested, of the $700,000 loss in year 1, um, 300,000 of it occurred prior to the decision to sell the segment, Jan to June. Remaining loss of 400,000 occurred after the decision to sell, which was July to December. Because if you remember, when did they take the decision? On July 1 year 1. On July 1 year 1 they took the decision. So now the accountant is basically providing a detail that total in this particular segment there is a $700,000 loss in year 1, out of which $300,000 happened in Jan to June and $400,000 loss occurred in July to December. So which one will you take? Okay, why don't you write your answers, just take a piece of paper and a pen, write your answers. Okay, so this exhibit is saying this. Also attached is a summarized segment balance sheet, assets and liabilities only for the segment in year 1. Let me know if you need any information. Now let's go to attachment number 1. Attachment number 1 is showing quarter ended March 31 year 2 and also the year ended December 31 year 1. So net sales, cost of goods sold, gross profit, operating expense, selling expense, general administrative, income from operations, other revenue gains, income before income tax. There was a loss of 700 in last year, out of which 300 happened from Jan to June and 400 happened July, or am I saying the other way? One second. Yeah, 300 happened from Jan to June and 400 happened from July to December. So that is the breakup of this 700. What happened to this? right? And in year 2, in Q1, there's a $200,000 loss. So we have now got information about the operating gain loss. Now let's look at the other exhibit, asset liability of only this segment: current assets, long-term assets, total assets, current liabilities, long-term liabilities, total liabilities. That means what is the net assets? 5925 minus 2925, $3 million. That $3 million they are saying will sell no more than $2.5 million. That means there is an impairment loss of, I'm almost telling you the answer, the impairment loss of 500,000. Okay. Okay, now please send your answers. Let's go row by row. Let's go row by row. Impairment gain loss of year 1 is how much and year 2 is how much? Let's go row by row, please. Send me your answers in the chat box. Okay, so Seshadri is asking, do we get a physical calculator and some white papers to do some paper working? So you are entitled to get a calculator, okay, not a scientific one, but the normal calculator. But you can't carry your own calculator. You have to ask for it from the invigilator. That's number one. Number two, what they do is, earlier they used to give A4 sheets paper, but now they have stopped giving paper. What they do, at least in the US, in India center, I'm not very sure. I will check and find, let you know. But normally in the Dubai and US centers, what they used to do, they give a transparent slide, a transparent plastic slide, or whatever that is made of, and they give a marker. So you can write on that plastic sheet with that marker, and I think they do it because they reuse it, right? So because these are not permanent markers, these are washable, so the ink can be washed, and then they will use it for another candidate. So they'll give you these plastic sort of sheets, okay? And calculator is allowed, but you'll have to ask. Sometimes what happens is, in one of our students case, what happened was, initially the invigilator declined. They denied they said that calculator is not allowed, and then she insisted that in CPA exams it is allowed. Please find out from whoever you have to find it from the state board, from AICPA. Please call up somebody and clarify. And then, this is a real incident I'm saying, and then they called up NASBA or somebody. They called up and got clarification that yes, you can provide a calculator to the candidate. Then she was given a candidate. So in this, half an hour was lost. I mean, she was continuing with her exam, but without a calculator. So after half an hour she got the calculator. So you have to make, tell them that in CPA exams calculator is allowed, so please provide one. Okay, now anybody wants to attempt this question, please send your answers. Otherwise, of course, I will explain. No, nobody wants to attempt? Okay, no problem. So as we can see here, the assets are 5925, 5,925,000, where my cursor is right now, right? And the liabilities are 2,925,000. That means the net assets are $3 million, right? 5,925 minus 2,925, $3 million. That is now being valued at 2.5. That means impairment gain loss is 500,000. Now let me write it over here, 500,000, okay, and accept. And in year 2 it's a 0 and accept. That's your row 1 complete. That's your row 1 complete. Now remember, you get marks. So let me show you this in the Becker software. If your entire row is correct, then it will turn green. Otherwise, it will become yellow or something. Okay, so you get marks row by row. If your 2 rows are correct and the third row is wrong, you will still get some marks. You will not get 0. You will get marks based on those 2 rows. So don't worry about it. Okay, operating profit year 1, we will take the entire 700,000 as a loss. Remember that regardless of when the decision was taken, we will take the entire year's loss under discontinued operations. So it was 700,000 in year 1, and in year 2 it is 200,000. Then gain loss on disposal. Gain loss on disposal, let's go back to the facts. It said that it was ultimately sold for 3.2 million. 3.2 million. Right? So in year 1, of course, it was not sold. In year 1, it was not sold. So obviously in year 1, the gain loss on disposal will be 0. Okay, now in year 2, it has been actually sold. So at what value it has been sold? 3.2 million. And what was the value? Let's enter this first. Minus, let's go to the facts. It said that on April 1, year 2, division was sold to We Love Winter for a sale price of 3.2. All season sports paid a broker's fee of 10% of the sale price. Okay. What happened to this? Okay. So 10%, that means 320,000. And then minus what it is standing at in the books, which is 2.5 million. Okay, it didn't take the calculation. Okay, it didn't take the calculation. So for calculation, you can use Excel or you can use a calculator. Okay, in the software also, and in the real exam software also, there is an inbuilt calculator. Here it is. So 3.2 million minus the broker's fee. What happened? One second. Yeah, it also keeps showing you the on the right. If you see, it keeps showing you the trail as to what calculations you did. Minus 2.5 million equals 380. So here we have to put 380. Now 380 is gain because it has been sold for more, right? And then finally the income tax impact, which is 30%. So 700 and 500, $1.2 million loss. 30% of that is a tax benefit of 360,000. Here again you can do the calculation. 200,000 and 380, which is 180. 180 into 30%, 54,000. The total gain loss from discontinued operation is an automated cell which has basically picked up our numbers and filled it, auto filled it. Okay. Now if I Now if I say show solution, then it will first color these cells with a green or a yellow. Green means we have done it correctly, yellow means wrong, right? So it is green, that means we have done it correctly. So this is how you have to approach a simulation question, right? First see what is required of you, what are they asking you to do, and then go step by step, look for the information that you need to fill that cell, and proceed accordingly. So this is the solution that they are showing here, which is tallying with obviously which we have done. Negative 500 and 0, negative 700 and negative 200, 0 and 380,000, and then 360 positive and negative 54,000. Right? Positive 360 is because it's a tax benefit, and negative 54 because it's a tax expense. Right? Let's go through one more from F2. Okay, here is F2. Let's do like I said, segment reporting simulation, and I want you to please try. Okay, let's first see what is the question asking. Teco Industries is a large company with 8 individual companies underneath its corporate umbrella. An accountant for the company is working on the financial statement footnotes and has generated the footnotes. See Exhibit Note R, segment reporting above regarding current year segment sales. Enter an amount in the associated cell or select yes or no from the option. Oh god, it's jumping very fast. Okay. Calculate the dollar threshold for the reportable segment size test. Then per the size test, determine which companies will be treated as reportable segments. Then calculate the dollar threshold for reportable segment reporting sufficiency test, and then determine the companies which will be treated as reportable segments. That means basically they are saying, tell us two things. Number one, what is the amount of the 10% test? What is the amount of the 75% test? Tell us these two amounts. And then also tell us which ones are reportable segments based on 10% criteria, which ones are reportable segments based on the 75% criteria. Now let's go through the exhibit to get the details. And now why don't you try, I'm giving you, let's say 5 to 7 minutes, at least give it a try, and then we will start discussing. So basically here you have external sales, internal sales, total sales. So this question is just on the basis of sales. They have not given the asset information or the profit loss information. Just on the basis of sales, which ones are reportable segment? First of all, what is the threshold which you will consider, to determine whether it is a reportable segment or not? You have to figure that amount first and then say which ones are reportable segments. So give it a try. Excuse me. Okay, anybody wants to share their answer? Rajiv is saying 380. Oh, 380 for that previous one. Okay, here ABDEF. Okay, 10% is 2150, 75% is 16125. No, 75% is not 16125. And what's your final answer? Like, which ones are the reportable segments after the sufficiency test also? Rajiv, what's your final answer? Is it ABDEF after the 75% test as well? %10 is ABDEF. What about 75% test? Is it still ABDEF or has it changed? Okay, no problem. Let me start discussing. But good try, I would say. See, here we will have to total for the 10% test. We will have to look at the total sales and revenue, internal and external. So if we add up these numbers, or we can do it here only so that you can see. I'm opening the calculator. Oh, the calculator is let's total these. 2.7 plus 2.4 plus 2.1 3.6 2450 5150 1.3 1.8. Have I done it correctly? Two point seven, 2.4, 2.1, 3.6, 2450, 5150, 1318. Okay, in this 2.1 million, the plus sign has not. Okay, anyways. So basically the total, I've done it on my phone. It is coming to 21.5 million, right? So 10% of that is right 2.15. And now based on that, which ones are reportable? A, B, D, E, F. These are more than 2.15 million. So A, B, D, E, F. Let's go to the sheet here and we will just have to say yes or no. Yes, yes, C is no, D is yes, E is yes, F is yes, G is no, H is no. Okay, now we will have to go to the external revenue column only and add up 23, 1750, 19, 36, 1550, 40, 850 and 18. 17,750, right? So basically 17.75 million external sales and revenue column. The total is 17.75 million. 75% of this 13.312,500, 13,312,500. So here I have to put 13,312,500. And now I will have to see that the segments that I had identified, which is A, B, D, E, F, their external revenue, is it totaling to this amount 13,312? If it is totaling to this amount, then my final answer is also A, B, D, E, F. If it is not totaling to this amount, then I have to identify one more segment or couple of more segments until I reach 13,312,500. So let's add up 23, B is 1750, D is 36, E 1550, F is 40. It is coming to 13.2 million. It is falling short. So it is falling short by how much? 13,312,500. It is falling short by 112,500. That means now we have to identify one more segment. And how do we identify the next segment? We have C with us, we have G and H. How do we identify? We take the next biggest. Okay, so whose external sales is biggest out of C, G and H? It is C. C is 1.9 million, H is 1.8 million, G is smaller. So we will take C as one of the reportable segments. So then our final answer will be A yes, B yes, C yes, D yes, E yes, F yes, G no, H no. This is my final answer, and now let's see whether it has turned green or not. Yes, it has turned green. Right, that means this is the answer. So again, very quickly, for the first step, the size test, you totaled the total sales and revenue column. You took 10% of that, compared the individual segments to that 10% amount. If that was 10% or more, then you took it as one of the segments. Then you came to the external sales and revenue column, totaled that, took 75% of that, which was 13,312,500. This amount, 13,312,500, 13.312 million. And then you added the external sales of the identified segments, whatever you had identified up to this stage. which was A, B, D, E, F. You totaled the external revenue of these 5 segments to see whether it was adding up to 13312 or not. So it was not, therefore we had to add one more to make it equal to or more than 13312. So we added segment C, and now our external revenue of all the reportable segments is crossing the 13312 limit. Therefore our final answer is A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay, is that clear? Correct, plus C. Okay, now just give me 1 second. Let me tell you the revenue threshold for the large accelerated, the amendment that has come in. Yes, it is 100 million. It is 100 million. So I am reading the line. Smaller reporting companies, which are entities with annual revenue of less than $100 million, are excluded from the definition of large accelerated filer or accelerated filer. That means they will not be considered, that they will be considered as others. That means they will have 90 days to file 10K and they will have 45 days to file 10Q, right? That is the only amendment in F1 and F2. And these amendments are applicable from, if you are appearing between October 1, 2020 and December 31, 2020, then certain amendments are applicable to you. And if you are appearing for the exam January 1, 2021 or later, then certain other amendments will also become applicable to you. This amendment that I just said is applicable for October 1 onwards. That means anybody who is appearing anytime now, because we are already in November, anytime, now going into 2021 also, this particular amendment is applicable. So for them, if they get a question in which the company's annual turnover is less than $100 million, it will not be considered as a accelerated or a large accelerated filer. That means it will be considered as other, and other means it will have 90 days for 10K and 45 days for 10Q. That is the only amendment from F1 and F2. F3 has certain amendments which we will cover in the next revision class, which is day after tomorrow, 20th, Friday. Okay, so we are pretty much on time. Also, before I sign off, let us just quickly see how many simulations are there in F1 and F2. Okay, since we have F2 already open over here, let's see that first. So there are 2 simulations in module 1. No simulation in module 2. 1 in subsequent events, so 2 plus 1, 3. Fair value has 1, 4. Segment reporting has 1, which we just did, 5. SEC does not have. Special purpose has 2, 7. Ratio has 1, 8. Partnership has 2. 10 simulations. But of course, simulation you will attempt when you are, thoroughly done with the chapter. F1, so nothing over here. 3 simulations in income statement and balance sheet, 1 in revenue recognition, so 3 and 1 4, 4 and 2 6, discontinued has 2, we have already done 1 together, right? So sorry, I lost. So 3 and 1 4, 4 and 2 6, 6 and 2 8, 8 and 5 simulations in accounting changes error corrections, 13, 13 1 14, 14 and 2 16, 16 simulations in F1 and 10 simulations in F2. Lot of simulation practice. Can you in the chat box, can you please confirm, have you started revision, have you started doing simulations on your own? What is the status? Seshadri, have you started revising? Rajiv, in case you have not started revising, please start. Day after tomorrow I'm going to cover 2 more chapters, then in next 5 sessions we'll revise the entire syllabus again. Okay, so Seshadri did simulations for profit, not for profit. Now in government accounting. Okay, great. So you have some idea of how this works. Fine. Thank you so much for attending. I will see you day after tomorrow. Thank you so much. Good night.